Why you feel alone, even when you pray. You pray, you believe, and still, you feel alone. That silence after prayer feels heavier than the problem itself. You're not imagining this. Anxiety doesn't disappear just because you talk to God. Fear doesn't leave on command. And many people feel overwhelmed, confused, even abandoned right after they pray. But almost no one talks about it honestly. And that's where the real question begins to form inside you. If God hears me, why does prayer sometimes feel empty? Here's what most people never realize. That silence is not rejection. God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are not absent. They may be working in a way your emotions can't recognize yet. Stay with me, because in this message you're going to understand what is really happening in the silence you're afraid of, and why this season is not abandonment. The moment prayer stops comforting you. There comes a moment when prayer stops doing what it used to do for you. You still believe. You still turn to God. You still choose to pray instead of giving up. But something has changed inside. The relief you once felt no longer arrives. The calm you expected does not settle in. Instead of peace, you are left with awareness. Awareness of how heavy your thoughts are. Awareness of fears you thought prayer would remove. Awareness of questions you were hoping God would answer quickly. This moment is deeply unsettling because most people are taught, directly or indirectly, that prayer should always make things feel better. When it does not, the mind immediately looks for someone to blame. Some blame themselves and assume they are doing something wrong. Others blame God and wonder if He is distant or disappointed. Very few consider the possibility that nothing is broken at all. When prayer stops comforting you, it often means it is no longer serving as emotional shelter. It is becoming a place of exposure. God is no longer soothing your discomfort before you face it. He is allowing you to sit with it, not to harm you, but to mature you. Comfort can protect you for a season, but it cannot transform you forever. This is where many people quietly pull away from prayer, not out of rebellion, but out of confusion. They keep praying out of habit, yet they feel more alone than before. They expected prayer to reduce the weight they were carrying, but instead it revealed how much weight was actually there. That revelation feels lonely because it removes the illusion that everything is under control. What you are experiencing is the loss of spiritual anesthesia. Prayer is no longer numbing your pain. It is sharpening your awareness. And awareness can feel unbearable at first because it forces you to confront parts of yourself you learned to avoid. Old distractions stop working. Old reassurances feel thin. The words still sound holy, but the internal comfort they once produced is gone. This is not God withdrawing from you. This is God refusing to distract you from what needs to be addressed. Comfort often keeps things quiet. Truth brings things to the surface. When prayer becomes uncomfortable, it means something real is being touched, something honest, something necessary. This stage feels intensely personal because no one can walk it for you. Advice sounds shallow. Encouragement feels distant. Even scripture can feel dry if it is read only to regain a feeling instead of to seek understanding. You are alone not because God has left, but because prayer has moved you into a space where feelings no longer lead the way. Here, prayer stops being a place you go to feel better and becomes a place you go to stay honest. That honesty is heavy at first. It exposes how much you relied on emotional relief instead of trust. It reveals how deeply you wanted God to change how you feel before changing how you see. If you misunderstand this moment, you may assume prayer has failed you. But if you stay with it, you begin to realize something important. Comfort was never the highest purpose of prayer. Relationship was. And real relationships pass through seasons where feelings go quiet and presence becomes the only proof that remains. This moment is not meant to push you away. It is meant to slow you down, to remove emotional shortcuts, to teach you how to remain with God even when nothing inside you is responding the way you hoped. That kind of prayer feels lonely because it strips away performance, expectation, and reward. But beneath that loneliness, something stronger is being formed. a faith that does not depend on relief, a trust that does not collapse in silence, a connection that does not require constant reassurance. That is why this moment feels so different. You are not losing prayer, you are crossing into a deeper expression of it. When faith outgrows emotional warmth, there is a quiet and confusing season when faith continues, but emotional warmth fades. You still believe in God, still acknowledge Jesus, still recognize the presence of the Holy Spirit, yet the inner sensations that once accompanied your faith no longer appear. Worship feels flatter, prayer feels neutral. The emotional response that once reassured you that everything was fine is gone. This absence is often misread as spiritual decline, but it is something very different. Emotional warmth is often the first way faith is experienced because emotions help us connect, especially in the beginning. They soften belief and make it feel alive. But emotions were never meant to carry the full weight of faith. They are fragile and inconsistent. When faith begins to mature, God allows emotions to step back so trust can step forward. This transition feels colder because warmth creates comfort, and comfort creates a sense of companionship. Without it, faith feels solitary. This is where many people struggle internally. They ask why their relationship with God no longer feels close. They wonder if they have grown distant, lost passion, or offended Him somehow. What is actually happening is a shift from emotional dependence to spiritual stability. God is teaching you to remain when there is no emotional incentive to stay. Faith that depends on emotional warmth cannot endure silence, suffering, or waiting. It collapses when feelings disappear. Mature faith remains steady even when the internal environment feels dry. That steadiness feels unfamiliar because it does not come with excitement or emotional reassurance. It feels quiet, almost ordinary. And that ordinariness is often mistaken for absence. This stage exposes how much we relied on emotions to tell us that God was near. When those signals stop, we feel uncertain because we no longer know how to measure closeness. Faith begins to ask different questions. Not do I feel God, but am I choosing to trust Him? Not does this feel comforting, but is this true? This shift can feel isolating because emotions often connect us to others. Shared excitement, shared tears, shared passion create community. When emotional warmth fades, faith becomes deeply personal. You realize that no one else can feel God for you. No one else can believe on your behalf. That realization creates a sense of aloneness that is difficult to explain. Yet this is the point where faith becomes resilient. You begin to discover that God does not withdraw His presence when emotions disappear. He removes emotional reinforcement so your belief can stand without support. This is not punishment, it is preparation. He is forming a faith that will not break when life becomes quiet, confusing, or painful. When faith outgrows emotional warmth, it stops chasing sensation and starts practicing fidelity. You remain not because it feels good, but because it is real. That kind of faith is steady, grounded, and enduring. It does not burn brightly, but it lasts. And though it feels lonely at first, it leads to a deeper, more stable connection than emotion ever could. The inner conflict between trust and control. There is a struggle that rarely gets named, yet it sits at the center of spiritual loneliness. It is the tension between trusting God and trying to control outcomes. Most people do not recognize this conflict because it hides beneath good intentions. You pray, you believe, you say you surrender, yet deep inside you are still holding expectations about how and when things should change. This internal split creates exhaustion. On the surface, you are reaching toward God. Beneath the surface, your mind is negotiating, predicting, preparing for disappointment. Prayer becomes mentally crowded. Instead of rest, it produces pressure. You leave prayer feeling more alone because you were never fully present. Part of you was still trying to manage the future. Control feels safe because it gives the illusion of protection. Trust feels risky because it requires letting go without guarantees. When prayer exposes this conflict, discomfort rises. You realize you want God's help, but you also want certainty. You want peace, but only if it comes in a form you recognize. That condition quietly blocks trust. God does not force surrender. He allows the tension to remain until you notice it. This is why prayer can feel unresolved. You are not being ignored. You are being invited to release what you are still gripping. That invitation feels lonely because control often acts like a companion. It gives structure, direction, and mental activity. When control loosens, silence takes its place. This silence can feel terrifying. Without control, you are left with vulnerability. Without plans, you are left with faith. That exposure creates a sense of being alone because no one can release control for you. Advice cannot do it. Logic cannot do it. It is a deeply personal decision. When you begin to recognize this conflict, prayer changes. You notice how often you pray with an outcome already chosen. You realize how rarely you allow God to lead the process instead of just approving your plan. That awareness can feel humbling and uncomfortable, but it is essential. Loneliness emerges here because trust does not provide immediate reassurance. Control fills space with noise. Trust fills it with quiet. Quiet can feel empty until you learn to rest in it. This is the point where many people retreat because they confuse quiet with loss. But if you remain, something shifts. Trust slowly replaces tension. Prayer becomes less about results and more about alignment. You are no longer trying to manage God's response. You are learning to remain present without demanding certainty. This conflict is not a sign of weak faith. It is a sign that faith is being refined. God is teaching you the difference between believing in Him and relying on Him. That lesson is never loud. It is learned in silence, and silence often feels like being alone before it feels like being free. Why your soul interprets waiting as rejection. Waiting has a way of reshaping the way you interpret everything. When answers come quickly, the mind feels secure. When they do not, the soul begins to tell stories. It fills the silence with meaning, and often that meaning is rejection. You wait, you pray, you remain faithful, yet nothing changes. Over time, the absence of movement starts to feel personal. The soul is not patient by nature. It seeks confirmation. It wants to know that effort matters and that faith is being noticed. When waiting stretches longer than expected, the soul begins to question whether it has been seen at all. This is where loneliness quietly takes root, not because God is absent, but because waiting removes visible proof of connection. Many people assume that if God cared, He would act quickly. That assumption turns time into a measuring tool for love. The longer the delay, the deeper the doubt. Prayer becomes harder not because belief disappears, but because hope feels fragile. You continue praying, yet part of you braces for disappointment. This is where waiting becomes spiritually dangerous if misunderstood. The soul starts interpreting stillness as disinterest. Silence becomes evidence. Delay becomes denial. These conclusions are rarely spoken out loud, but they shape how you approach God. Prayer becomes guarded. Trust becomes conditional. God does not hurry the way humans do, not because He is indifferent, but because His work is not limited to visible outcomes. While you wait, something is being formed internally. But internal formation offers no immediate reassurance. It requires trust without proof. This is why waiting feels so lonely. You cannot see progress. You cannot measure growth. You can only remain. And remaining without feedback feels like standing alone in the dark. Yet this darkness is not empty. It is unlit. There is a difference. Waiting reveals what you expect prayer to do for you. If prayer was meant to secure quick answers, waiting feels like failure. If prayer is meant to shape the soul, waiting becomes necessary. That shift in understanding changes how you experience delay. God's silence during waiting is not passive. It is purposeful. He allows time to stretch so trust can deepen beyond immediate reward. The loneliness you feel is not rejection. It is the absence of instant reassurance, which forces faith to develop roots instead of wings. If you stay present in waiting, something subtle happens. You stop measuring God by outcomes and begin recognizing Him in endurance. That recognition transforms loneliness into quiet strength, but it only happens if you resist the urge to interpret delay as abandonment. The loss of spiritual familiarity. There is a season when God no longer feels familiar. The prayers you once spoke with ease now feel foreign. The language that once flowed naturally feels stiff. Even scripture can sound distant, as if it were written to someone else. This loss of familiarity is deeply unsettling because familiarity creates safety. When it disappears, the relationship feels unstable. Spiritual familiarity forms through repetition. You learn what prayer feels like. You learn how God usually responds. You grow accustomed to certain rhythms of comfort, clarity, and reassurance. Over time, those rhythms become expectations. When they stop repeating, the soul feels disoriented. Many people interpret this shift as distance. They assume God has changed or withdrawn. In reality, it is often the believer who is changing. Growth alters perception. What once felt sufficient no longer reaches the same depth. God does not remain static while you evolve. He meets you where you are becoming, not where you were. This unfamiliarity creates loneliness because it removes predictability. You no longer know what to expect in prayer. The sense of control provided by routine fades. You are left without a clear emotional map. That uncertainty feels isolating because it cannot be explained easily to others. God allows this loss of familiarity to prevent faith from becoming mechanical. When prayer becomes predictable, it risks becoming performative. Familiarity can dull attentiveness. By removing it, God invites you to engage more honestly and more deeply. In this season, faith feels awkward. You may struggle to express yourself spiritually. Silence feels longer. Words feel inadequate. That discomfort often tempts people to retreat to old habits or seek spiritual noise to recreate familiarity. But noise cannot replace depth. This phase teaches you to approach God without assumptions. You stop relying on how things used to feel and begin discovering who God is beyond your expectations. That discovery requires humility and patience. It cannot be rushed. Loneliness emerges here because familiarity once acted as companionship. When it disappears, you feel exposed. Yet this exposure is not meant to leave you unanchored. It is meant to loosen your grip on a version of faith that no longer fits. As unfamiliar as this season feels, it is not a sign of loss. It is a sign of movement. God is not becoming distant. He is becoming deeper, and depth always feels unfamiliar before it feels secure again. When prayer becomes exposure instead of refuge. There is a moment when prayer stops feeling like a safe place and starts feeling like a mirror. You come to God hoping to be soothed, but instead you become aware of thoughts you were avoiding, fears you buried, and motives you never questioned. Prayer no longer hides you, it reveals you. That shift can feel threatening because refuge protects, while exposure confronts. Many people were taught to use prayer as a place to escape pain, to quiet anxiety, to calm the heart. And for a time, God allows prayer to function that way. But there comes a season when refuge alone is no longer enough. Growth requires honesty, and honesty requires exposure. This is where prayer begins to feel uncomfortable. You sit in silence, and instead of peace, unresolved emotions rise. Doubt surfaces, anger appears. Questions you never wanted to ask make themselves known. You are not being attacked. You are being invited to stop hiding from yourself. Exposure feels lonely because it strips away the illusion that you are spiritually composed. You realize how much you depended on prayer to avoid confronting deeper issues. When prayer brings those issues forward, it feels like betrayal. But it is not betrayal. It is care. God does not expose what He does not intend to heal. He brings hidden things into awareness because healing cannot occur in secrecy. This process feels isolating because no one else can see what you are facing internally. You may still appear faithful, calm, and strong on the outside, while inside you are wrestling with truths that feel heavy and personal. Prayer becomes quieter in this stage because noise would interfere with clarity. God is not speaking less. He is allowing you to listen more honestly. That listening is uncomfortable because it removes excuses and spiritual shortcuts. You can no longer pray around your pain. You have to acknowledge it. This stage often tempts people to avoid prayer altogether, not because they lack faith, but because prayer now demands presence instead of escape. It requires you to remain with what hurts without immediate relief. That requirement feels like abandonment if you expect prayer to function only as refuge. But prayer was never meant to be a hiding place forever. It is also a place of transformation. Exposure is not the opposite of refuge, it is the doorway to it. God removes false safety so true healing can begin. When you remain in prayer during this stage, something changes slowly. You stop performing. You stop filtering your words. You stop trying to sound faithful. You become honest. That honesty creates a deeper connection than comfort ever could. Loneliness fades gradually here, not because answers arrive, but because authenticity replaces pretense. You realize God has not left you exposed. He has stayed with you in the exposure. And that presence, though quiet, is deeply stabilizing. The loneliness created by outgrowing old versions of yourself. There is a specific kind of loneliness that appears when you are no longer who you used to be, but not yet fully who you are becoming. Prayer often accelerates this process. As your inner life changes, old patterns lose their power. Old comforts stop working. Even old ways of relating to God begin to feel insufficient. This transition creates distance, not only from others, but from parts of yourself. Outgrowing an old version of yourself feels unsettling because familiarity disappears. You can no longer rely on previous habits, reactions, or beliefs to guide you. Prayer exposes this shift by making you aware of how much has changed internally. You notice that what once satisfied you spiritually now feels shallow. That realization is often accompanied by grief. This loneliness is rarely talked about because it does not fit common narratives of spiritual growth. Growth is usually described as clarity, confidence, or joy. But before those qualities appear, there is often disorientation. You feel suspended between identities. You cannot return to what was, and you cannot yet see what will be. Prayer intensifies this stage because it removes distractions that might otherwise numb the discomfort. In silence, you become aware of the gap between who you were and who you are becoming. That gap feels empty. It feels like loss. It feels lonely because no one else can occupy that space with you. This is also the point where relationships may shift. People who connected to the old version of you may no longer understand you. Conversations feel strained. Shared language fades. You may feel unseen even among those who care about you. That social distance deepens the internal sense of isolation. God allows this loneliness because transformation requires separation. Growth cannot occur while everything remains the same. By allowing old versions of yourself to fall away, God is making room for something more aligned with truth. But release always precedes replacement. This stage tests your willingness to remain faithful without recognition or affirmation. You may feel misunderstood by others and uncertain within yourself. Prayer becomes a place where you bring confusion rather than clarity. That vulnerability feels risky, but it is necessary. As uncomfortable as this season is, it is not permanent. The loneliness is a sign of movement, not stagnation. You are in transition. You are being reshaped, and reshaping always feels isolating before it feels whole. If you remain present in this stage, prayer slowly becomes less about who you were and more about who you are becoming. That shift brings stability, but only after the loneliness has done its work. You are not being left behind. You are being led forward, even if the path feels empty for now. The silence that teaches you to listen differently. Silence is often misunderstood as absence because it removes stimulation. When prayer becomes quiet, many people assume nothing is happening. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is a change in how communication occurs. God does not stop engaging when words fade. He shifts the way he is perceived. At first, silence feels uncomfortable because it removes familiar signals. There are no emotional cues to interpret, no immediate reassurance, no clear direction. You are left without feedback, and without feedback, the mind begins to search for meaning. That search often produces anxiety before understanding. Silence teaches you to listen without relying on noise. It trains awareness instead of reaction. In this space, you begin to notice subtle internal movements, a change in perspective, a quiet conviction, a growing clarity that does not announce itself loudly. These shifts are easy to miss if you expect God to speak only through strong emotions or clear answers. This kind of listening requires patience. It asks you to slow down mentally and emotionally, to stop filling every pause with words, to remain present without trying to force resolution. That stillness feels lonely at first because it removes distraction, and distraction often feels like company. Many people resist silence because it exposes their internal restlessness. Without sound, you become aware of how often you seek stimulation to avoid discomfort. Silence interrupts that pattern. It brings you face to face with your thoughts, your fears, and your expectations. That confrontation feels unsettling, but it is necessary. God uses silence to recalibrate your attention. When everything becomes quiet, you learn to discern what truly matters. Noise often disguises confusion. Silence reveals it. Through this process, prayer becomes less about speaking and more about perceiving. This stage changes the way you relate to God. You stop demanding immediate answers. You begin recognizing presence without explanation. That recognition is subtle, but deeply stabilizing. It teaches you that connection does not require constant interaction. Silence also removes pressure. Without words, there is no performance. No need to sound faithful, no expectation to feel a certain way. You are simply present. That presence, though quiet, is honest, and honesty builds a deeper form of trust. As you learn to listen differently, silence becomes less threatening. It no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like space. Space to process. Space to grow. Space to recognize God beyond familiar expressions. This shift does not happen quickly. It develops gradually as you remain willing to stay without forcing meaning. Over time, silence becomes less about what is missing and more about what is forming. When you stop fearing silence, prayer changes. It becomes steady rather than dramatic, grounded rather than emotional. And though it feels quieter, it becomes more real. Silence no longer separates you from God. It becomes the place where you learn how to stay with Him without needing proof. When God refuses to be reduced to a feeling, there is a subtle danger in associating God too closely with how you feel. Feelings are powerful, but they are unstable. They rise and fall with circumstances, health, stress, and expectation. When faith is built primarily on emotional experience, it becomes fragile. God knows this. That is why there are seasons when He allows feelings to withdraw. This withdrawal feels personal because emotions create confirmation. When you feel peace, joy, or reassurance, you assume God is near. When those sensations disappear, you assume He is distant. But God is not an emotion. He cannot be measured by sensation. Reducing Him to a feeling limits the relationship to something shallow and conditional. In these seasons, prayer feels less rewarding. You do not receive the emotional response you expected. That absence challenges how you understand closeness. You are forced to ask whether you are seeking God Himself or the comfort He provides. That question is uncomfortable because it exposes attachment to outcome rather than relationship. God allows this tension to refine faith. He removes emotional confirmation so belief can exist without dependency. This is not rejection, it is protection. Faith rooted in feeling collapses when feelings fail. Faith rooted in truth remains steady. This stage often creates loneliness because feelings once acted as evidence of connection. Without them, you feel uncertain. You may continue praying, but part of you wonders if it matters. That uncertainty can lead to withdrawal if misunderstood. Yet this is where faith becomes more honest. You begin to recognize that God's presence does not fluctuate with your emotional state. He is consistent even when you are not. That realization stabilizes belief, though it feels less exciting. God refuses to be reduced to a sensation because sensations fade. He invites you into a relationship that endures beyond emotional cycles. That invitation requires trust without reward. It requires remaining without immediate feedback. As you stay in this space, something shifts internally. You stop chasing feelings and start practicing fidelity. Prayer becomes quieter but more grounded. You are no longer seeking proof of God's nearness. You are learning to trust it. This stage reshapes how you interpret spiritual experience. You begin to value consistency over intensity, presence over sensation. That shift removes pressure and creates a deeper, more resilient faith. Loneliness gradually gives way to steadiness. You may not feel God the way you once did, but you become more certain of Him. And certainty rooted in truth lasts far longer than emotion ever could. The private season. No one can walk with you. There is a season in the spiritual life that cannot be shared, explained, or carried by anyone else. It is the season where advice sounds empty, encouragement feels distant, and even the presence of people who love you does not ease the weight you feel. You are not isolated because you pushed others away. You are isolated because what you are facing cannot be transferred. This private season feels heavy because it removes external support systems. You realize that no one can believe for you, wait for you, or trust God on your behalf. Prayer becomes deeply personal, almost stripped of language. You find yourself sitting with God more than speaking to Him. That stillness can feel unbearable because it exposes how much you relied on others to validate your faith. Many people interpret this stage as abandonment. They wonder why God would allow them to feel so alone when they are trying to remain faithful. But this season is not about loss. It is about ownership. God is inviting you to take full responsibility for your relationship with Him without leaning on borrowed strength. In this space, faith is no longer reinforced by community response, shared emotion, or collective certainty. It stands alone. That aloneness is uncomfortable because it removes comparison. You can no longer measure your faith against others. You are left with your own honesty. This season often arrives quietly. There is no clear transition. One day you realize that familiar supports no longer reach you. Sermons feel distant. Conversations feel surface level. You are still present, but internally you are walking a path no one else can see. That invisibility deepens the loneliness. God allows this private season because some forms of growth require solitude, not isolation, but separation from external influence. In this space, faith becomes less performative and more sincere. You stop doing things because they are expected. You begin doing them because they are necessary. This stage tests your motivation. Without affirmation or clarity, you must decide whether you will remain present anyway. That decision reshapes belief. Faith becomes quieter, less expressive, but more rooted. It no longer needs witnesses. Loneliness here serves a purpose. It removes dependency. It strengthens internal alignment. It teaches you how to remain faithful without reinforcement. This is not a punishment. It is preparation for stability. If you endure this season without rushing to escape it, something subtle changes. You become less reactive, less anxious for answers, more grounded in presence. Prayer becomes less about relief and more about connection. This private season does not last forever, but it leaves a lasting mark. It produces a faith that does not collapse under pressure, a trust that does not require constant reassurance, and a relationship with God that is owned, not inherited. You are not walking alone because God left. You are walking alone because this part of the journey can only be walked by you. Learning to remain without relief. There is a point in the spiritual journey where prayer no longer offers relief, and yet you are invited to stay anyway. This is one of the most difficult lessons faith teaches. Remaining without relief goes against every instinct. The mind wants resolution, the heart wants comfort, the soul wants reassurance. When none of these arrive, staying feels almost unreasonable. At this stage, prayer no longer functions as a solution. It becomes a discipline of presence. You come before God not to feel better, not to receive clarity, not to calm your emotions, but simply to remain. That shift feels unnatural because most relationships are maintained through exchange. You give, you receive. Here, you give attention without receiving anything tangible in return. This is where many people quietly leave prayer behind, not because they stop believing, but because prayer no longer rewards them. Remaining without relief feels like standing still while everything inside you urges movement. It creates inner resistance. You wonder what the point is. You question whether staying matters. God allows this season because relief, while helpful, can become a dependency. When faith depends on emotional reward, it becomes conditional. God is forming something stronger. He is teaching you how to remain connected even when nothing changes externally or internally. This kind of remaining strips prayer of transaction. You stop asking what prayer will do for you and start allowing it to shape who you are. That shaping is slow. It offers no immediate feedback. It feels like effort without payoff. That is why it feels lonely. Without relief, your motivations surface. You become aware of why you pray. Is it to escape discomfort or to remain connected to truth? This awareness can feel confronting. It removes spiritual shortcuts and exposes your expectations. Remaining without relief teaches endurance. Not dramatic endurance, but quiet consistency. You show up even when nothing responds. You stay even when silence stretches. That consistency reshapes the nervous system. It calms the impulse to flee discomfort. It teaches the soul how to remain grounded without stimulation. This stage also softens control. When relief is removed, there is nothing to manage. You are forced to accept what is. That acceptance does not mean approval. It means presence. Presence without resistance slowly transforms inner tension. Over time, remaining without relief changes how you experience loneliness. The loneliness does not disappear, but it loses its sharpness. It becomes less threatening. You realize you can remain present even when you feel empty. That realization builds resilience. Prayer in this stage becomes less about outcome and more about alignment. You are not trying to fix yourself. You are allowing yourself to be shaped. That shaping happens quietly, beneath awareness. This lesson is uncomfortable, but it is powerful. Those who learn to remain without relief develop a faith that does not fracture under pressure. They do not require constant reassurance to stay connected. They know how to remain when nothing responds. This kind of faith is rare because it is formed in silence, not in breakthrough. But it is strong, and it prepares you for a deeper understanding of presence that is not dependent on feeling, circumstance, or reward. You were never abandoned. You were being prepared. There is a truth that becomes clear only after you have walked through silence, loneliness, and waiting long enough to stop fighting them. The truth is this: you were never abandoned. What felt like distance was preparation. What felt like loss was restructuring. What felt like God stepping back was Him working deeper than your emotions could detect. Preparation rarely feels gentle. It feels disorienting because it removes what you depended on. God does not prepare by adding more noise or reassurance. He prepares by removing what cannot sustain you long-term. Emotional dependency, external validation, predictable patterns. When those things fall away, it feels like everything familiar has disappeared. Loneliness often appears when old supports are no longer allowed to carry you. Not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. God prepares you by teaching you how to stand without leaning. That standing feels exposed at first. You feel unprotected, but what is actually happening is strengthening. Looking back, you may realize that if comfort had remained, growth would have stalled. If answers had come quickly, trust would have stayed shallow. If relief had arrived every time, endurance would never have formed. God prepared you by allowing the process to unfold slowly. This preparation reshapes how you relate to Him. You stop approaching God only when you need something. You learn to remain when nothing changes. That remaining builds a quiet confidence. You no longer panic in silence. You no longer interpret waiting as rejection. You recognize these spaces as formative. What once felt like abandonment now reveals itself as intentional distance from distraction. God was not absent. He was redirecting your attention inward, strengthening your foundation, refining your motives. He was preparing you for a faith that could survive confusion, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Preparation often feels lonely because it is personal. No one else can carry it for you. No one else can feel the internal shift happening over time. But when the preparation is complete, you notice the change. You are steadier, less reactive, less desperate for reassurance, more grounded in presence. This is where peace begins to emerge, not as a feeling, but as stability. You trust without urgency. You pray without expectation. You remain without fear. That peace does not announce itself loudly. It settles quietly, the way something solid does. Understanding this reframes everything you have experienced. The silence was not empty. The loneliness was not pointless. The waiting was not wasted. Each moment was shaping you into someone who could remain faithful without constant confirmation. God prepares in silence because silence reveals what noise hides. He prepares through loneliness because loneliness exposes where faith still depends on comfort. He prepares through waiting because waiting strengthens trust beyond immediate reward. If you are here now, still praying, still searching, still remaining despite confusion, then something important is happening inside you. You are not being pushed away. You are being prepared for a deeper, steadier, more resilient relationship with God. That preparation is not easy, but it is meaningful. And one day you will recognize that the season you feared was the very season that formed you.